Hey, thank you so much, Varisha, for hosting us tonight. And I'm going to just introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Brenda Miles. So, Dr. Miles is a clinical and pediatric neuropsychologist, and she is the creative director of the Possibilities Clinic. Now, a neuropsychologist is a psychologist, but one that has extra training in brain physiology. And I think you'll find her talk as well very brain centered, which is, not always the focus of psychology talks. She completed her PhD in developmental psychology at the University of Toronto and then did her postdoctoral training in neuropsychology at the Hospital of Sick Kids. At Possibilities, Dr. Miles is part of the assessment team where she offers assessments of psychoeducational, neuropsychological assessments. And she also works in a specialized service for tics and Tourette's, offering a very intriguing treatment called CBIT, which is very innovative behavioral treatment, very effective treatment for managing tics. She calls the program, I think she calls it training for tics, superpower training for tics. I'm sorry. And I know that sometimes she shows up to the tic sessions with a red superhero cape. Is that right, Dr. Miles? I
That
believe
is
so.
correct.
So that's what I've been told by some of my clients that they tell me how much they love her when she shows up in that cape. She is very passionate about translating complex science into very clear, practical strategies for parents and kids and teachers too. And she is an extremely accomplished author. That's part of the whole idea of knowledge translation. She has a number of books that she's published with a very prestigious Imagination Press, which is the imprint of the American Psychological Association. I believe that she's closing in onto 300,000 books in print. So it's quite a lot. I know she's very modest about her accomplishment. Her upcoming title, As S'more is Enough, S'more is Enough, which is out next month. S'more is in s'more, S apostrophe MORE is enough, follows the journey of a s'more who discovers you can be more and enough at the same time. And she has other works that include Pizza Melts Down from her popular Food for Thought series and Dance and Roar Like a Dinosaur, a lively book with line dancing moves to energize young learners. So I think she is extremely accomplished, and I feel that you'll find her insights into the brain, dyslexia, just like things. Anytime I listen to talks, I learn things that I've never heard of. Oh, in addition, I also want to mention that she leads possibilities clinics. We we contract to the Ontario government's demonstration schools. Demonstration schools are there to showcase kind of cutting edge treatments for issues like dyslexia, and Dr. Miles leads Possibilities Clinic's consulting team across Ontario's provincial demonstration schools. So I could go on with her accomplishment, but I know we have a lot of stuff to cover, and I know Dr. Miles will want to get a lot of info out there. So with all that, please help me welcome Dr. Miles. I'll pass it over to you now. And after Dr. Miles speaks, we'll have some time for Q&A. Please put your questions in the chat. And I might answer some in the chat as well if I can answer some. But most of them will be, Varisha will bring them up to Dr. Miles at the end. And please mute your microphones. Thank you. And the Dr. Varisha said the talk is being recorded, but as long as you mute and you don't show yourself on video, only Dr. Miles and the slides will be on the video. So thank you so much for coming here tonight, Dr.
Okay,
Miles.
thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. So welcome to Rewire for Reading, Hope and Help for Dyslexia at Any Age. Let's get right into it. What is dyslexia? So here's a quotation from Jack Fletcher, And Dr. Fletcher is a neuropsychologist who has devoted his professional life to the science of reading. And if you go on the highly informative American site called Reading Rockets and listen to any interview with Jack Fletcher, you know the science is going to be top-notch, informed, and evidence-based. His definition of dyslexia is widely accepted in the scientific literature, and that one is the one I'm going to use today. So dyslexia occurs primarily at the level of the single word and involves the ability to decode and spell printed words in isolation accurately and automatically. That's without any context. So kids with dyslexia can sound very robotic when they're reading. So sounding out is a chore well past grade 2 or 3 when reading is supposed to sound automatic and fluent. And kids who are dyslexic will also take a lot of guesses at words based on the surface structure of the word. So farmer might be read as family since the words kind of look the same. And when I'm speaking with families who are worried about their child's reading, they will often say, my child guesses at words. And then the parent says, well, I'll tell my child to slow down and sound it out. But the child inevitably reverts back to guessing based on what the whole word kind of looks like. And we'll talk about why that might be the case as the talk proceeds. So interestingly, scans of children and adults who read well show a series of areas in the brain that are important for reading, and these areas are connected in the left side of the brain to form a reading network. Areas involved in this reading sort of network include the occipital lobe at the back and the bottom, which is really important for visual processing. Higher areas at the back of the brain called the parietal lobe are also involved. When we talk tonight, I'm going to be showing you scans of this area. I'm not sure if you can see my pointer here, but this area called the temporal lobe, which is almost like a folded arm right over your left ear, that's going to be a really important area, so keep that in mind. And reading also involves the brain's frontal lobe. So we'll take a closer look at this network, and the network forms a ventral or sight recognition pathway at the back, which is the green, and a dorsal decoding pathway at the top. Now, since ADHD often occurs with dyslexia, I offer a brief definition of ADHD here. Dyslexia will certainly be the focus of the talk, but I can't ignore ADHD. ADHD is a neurobiological, highly genetic condition that affects self-regulation and a number of executive functions. Brain circuits have also been outlined for ADHD, and they are extensive, as you can see. They involve areas in the brain's bark, that's that kind of wrinkly outside part called the cortex, as well as structures deep within the brain classified as
Dr.
subcortical.
Miles.
Mentioned,
Perfect.
so this is single word level. In case you didn't see this slide, this is the reading network. This is on the left side of the brain, which involves the occipital temporal at the back, which is important for visual processing. You also have this temporal lobe. Can you see my pointer now? Maybe on the brain, which is like a folded arm around your left ear. This is a really important area, which we'll talk about further on in the talk. And then we have a dorsal decoding pathway higher up. Okay, now this is the definition that I went over for ADHD. And these are the circuits, which are circuits and structures implicated in ADHD, which is very complex, which involves structures at both the cortical level, which is kind of the brain bark, that wrinkly area, and also pathways and structures deep within the brain, which are considered subcortical. Okay, now, there are certain areas of overlap in terms of brain areas implicated in dyslexia and ADHD. For example, in ADHD and dyslexia, both the frontal lobes and the parietal lobes have been implicated. Now, the focus of this talk will be dyslexia, but I need to devote some time to ADHD because if we forget about ADHD, we can run into some difficulty when it comes to treating dyslexia effectively. So both ADHD and LD occur in roughly 10% of children. So if you're a teacher with a class of 26 kids, chances are that 3 of your students will have dyslexia, 3 may have ADHD. But dyslexia and ADHD also occur together in about 25 to 50% of cases. So if you have a child with an LD, for example, in reading, there's a 50% chance that ADHD will also be in the mix. And that percentage works in the other direction too. So if a child has ADHD, there's a good chance that LD is also in the mix, and it could be dyslexia. Now, before I go on, I want you to sit back, relax, and take a deep breath. It can be upsetting for some to hear a talk like this. If you're concerned about your child's reading, if you're frustrated about a lack of progress despite everything you have tried, and if you feel there is no hope. What I'd like to do tonight is reset and try to reframe the problem. First of all, you are here seeking information, and that is fortunate for the children you are trying so hard to support. So let me introduce you to a children's book you probably haven't heard of. Fortunately, it was written by Remy Charlotte, and when it was published in 1964. And it alternates between color and black and white illustrations. And once I start to read a bit of the book, you'll probably understand why. Here we go. Fortunately, one day, Ned got a letter that said, "Please come to a surprise party." But unfortunately, the party was in Florida and he was in New York. Fortunately, a friend loaned him an airplane. Unfortunately, the motor exploded. Fortunately, there was a parachute in the airplane. Unfortunately, there was a hole in the parachute. Fortunately, there was a haystack on the ground. Unfortunately, there was a pitchfork in the haystack. The story goes on and on like this, and trust me, Ned does get to that birthday party in New York. You'll have to get a copy of the book to learn how he reaches the desired outcome after a series of fortunate events as well as a series of setbacks. You probably already have experienced a series of setbacks in your search for interventions that work, in your discussions with schools. I want you to focus on the fortunatelys as much as you can and think about the desired end goal that you were working so hard to get to. Now, unfortunately, many myths continue concerning dyslexia, and they're very similar to the myths that you hear in ADHD, and they can paint a dark picture with little hope. Know the facts, find the bright spots, focus on fortunately. So here are some unfortunate myths about dyslexia, which mirrors the kind of myths you hear about ADHD. People with dyslexia just need to try harder. Here is a fortunate fact. Dyslexia is a neurobiological condition that affects the ability to sound out words even when you're trying hard. And perhaps I misdescribed it when I said fortunately, but I want you to know that it's not about whether or not you're trying hard. There is a brain difference here, and researchers know about this brain difference and know what to do about it. That is the fortunately. Okay. Here is another unfortunate myth. How best to treat dyslexia is a mystery because we don't really know what works. That's what is said also in ADHD. However, here is the fortunately, how best to treat dyslexia is known and supported by decades of research evidence. Here is another unfortunate, and I must say devastating mix. Kids with dyslexia just need time to catch up in their reading. Here is a fact. Kids with dyslexia need scientifically supported treatment to rewire brain circuits that support reading and prevent widening gaps. And you are going to learn tonight that dyslexic brains can be rewired for reading, and that is a fortunate fact. Now, here is a fortunate event that came out of the Ontario Human Rights Commission. The Ontario's Right to Read public inquiry unfortunately gave schools a failing grade for a lack of evidence-based interventions. The summary of the report and the updated report says that reading is a fundamental human right. They are arguing that schools implement early screening for reading difficulties in grades K to grade 2. They also want improved teacher training on the science of reading, the provision of structured evidence-based programming with explicit instruction in phonemic awareness, phonics, and decoding, which you're going to find out is the key to rewiring a dyslexic brain. They also argue for strengthening accommodations and supports for students with dyslexia. And I want you to keep this in mind. There are two important messages here, not only the provision of structured evidence-based programming, but also the strengthening and provision of accommodations. And I'm going to talk about that at the end of this talk. I want to say I moved the slides too quickly, but I think unfortunately a lot of schools are not set up to provide either the screening or the follow-through with structured evidence-based intervention. So that's an unfortunate part, but at least the need for science of reading schools is at the forefront now. The Right to Read inquiry did bring the science of reading into the forefront, as I mentioned, but I think this US podcast had an even bigger effect. I encourage you to follow Sold a Story podcast from journalist Emily Hanford on American Public Media. She covers what people have long known or called the reading wars. And what's really unfortunate and really enraging is that neuroscientists and neuropsychologists have known for a very long time how brains learn to read and what solid instruction needs to look like so that dyslexic brains can become reading brains. But too many schools have not listened to this advice or to the science for too many years. So teaching methods not supported by science are producing non-readers and placing students who are at risk for dyslexia at even greater risk and resulting in them being even further behind. So I think the podcast brought the science of reading and the whole controversy out in a very big way. I encourage you to listen to the podcast. It is indeed enlightening, entertaining, also enraging. Okay. This is a book by Max Greenfield, illustrated by the wonderful Mike Lowry. Maybe teachers know of it already. I don't want to read this book. Dyslexia is a reading issue, but it's also very much a mental health issue. So here is some data from a study of children 8 to 18 who are identified as having either a reading disability, which are the gray bars, ADHD alone, which are the white bars, and a combination of ADHD and reading disability in the black bars. And the control kids are the crosshatch pattern. So researchers basically place kids in these groups based on testing and diagnostic criteria, and then looked at their mental health 5 years out. 5 years out, children with reading disability exhibited higher rates of academic difficulties, not surprising, but also higher rates of depression and adolescent onset conduct disorder. Those with a combination of reading disability and ADHD showed even greater impairment than groups with either disorder alone on academic functioning and social emotional difficulties. So the bottom line, if a child has either a reading disability or ADHD alone, that child is at increased risk, not only for negative academic outcomes, but also negative mental health outcomes as adolescents and young adults. And when dyslexia and ADHD occur together, you have to consider treatments for both conditions. Now, other studies show that mental health challenges in struggling readers emerge over time and begin to appear quite early in elementary schools. Now, some studies have found no distinguishable differences in symptoms of anxiety or depression in grade 3 students with reading challenges. However, this is the kicker, symptoms of depression and anxiety are more likely to be seen in grade 5 in students who struggle to read. And these mental health challenges, as I just mentioned from the earlier study, will persist into adolescence and adulthood. So we really need to think about interventions to reduce the risk of these emotional outcomes happening downstream. So why is there sort of no distinguishable differences in mental health outcomes around grade 3, but suddenly you're seeing these downstream effects in grade 5? What is going on here? So there is a big shift in reading that happens around grade 2 or 3. So before grade 2 or 3, you are learning to read. But after grade 3, the expectation is that you are reading to learn. So if you're in grade 4 or 5 or 6, if you need to learn about science, you read it. If you need to learn about current events, you read it. And you can imagine the huge burden this places on struggling readers after grade 3 if they're expected to access the curriculum without assistive technology. Gaps are going to grow, frustrations are going to grow, mental health challenges are going to grow. Bear with me, though. We're going to focus on the fortunately as we move through this talk. When we think about growing gaps for struggling readers, it's really important to discuss the Matthew effect. And the Matthew effect is coined by psychologist Keith Stanovich, who is a reading researcher, and it comes from the Bible parable, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. So I'm not sure if you can see my pointer now, but if you look at the two dots, the first two dots, the green are your successful readers and the red are your struggling readers. Early in grade 1, they look fairly indistinguishable when it comes to the words they can read accurately per minute, and that's called reading fluency at the single word level. But fairly soon into grade 2 and 3, the gap between successful readers and struggling readers widens. And so this gap is growing exponentially over time. So what is happening here? Readers who read well, who can sound out words well with elegant brain circuitry in the left hemisphere, can sound out anything, and they're sounding out accurately as they gain more practice. So they're going to read more and more books. And so when they read more and more books and they see more and more words that they can decode accurately, those become part of their sight word vocabulary, words they can read automatically, so their speed skyrockets. But as struggling readers advance in grade, they face more and more unfamiliar words as textbooks become more challenging. So they're using this effortful, inaccurate decoding, and it slows them down. So if my voice raises a little bit here, it's intentional, okay? Look at this graph. Based on the science of reading, it makes no sense, absolutely no sense whatsoever for school boards to say, let's wait until grade 3 or 4 to see how this reading kind of sorts out. That is a wrong approach. It is an anti-science of reading approach. You need to intervene early, ideally before grade 3. That doesn't mean there's no hope for readers who are struggling after that. You can still create decoding brains. But ideally intervene before grade 3, before gaps are large and mental health risks increase. It is heartbreaking for parents of children who struggle to read. And sadly, there are those who are going to take advantage and try to sell parents therapies that are not based on science and that are not going to work. What we know from science, okay, is that in order to improve reading or writing or math, you have to read or write or do math. There are no shortcuts. Readers with dyslexia don't sound out words significantly better with rose-colored glasses or rose overlays. Vision therapy is not supported to change the brains of dyslexic readers. Now, I will give a caveat here. If there is a convergence problem, if your child sees the world double, words are double on a page, trees are double, focus is fuzzy, convergence is an issue that needs to be corrected before you do evidence-based reading intervention. But other vision therapy is not supported to change a dyslexic brain. Biofeedback is also not an appropriate therapy for changing brain circuits for reading. There is sorry, I'm trying to advance here. Some people will say, what's the harm in trying? What's the harm in trying everything? Okay, there are side effects of unproven therapies. First of all, they're expensive. You're losing money on something you think is going to work and it's not going to work. Secondly, time is being lost. If you're working with ineffective tutoring or biofeedback for 1 or 2 years, remember that Matthew effect. Gaps are growing and changes aren't happening in fundamental, meaningful, and sustainable ways. So you need to get to effective early intervention as quickly as possible. There is also psychological harm in trying unproven and unhelpful interventions. So you start a child in therapy and nothing's changing. So guess what happens? The child thinks that therapies are useless. And I've run into this in CBIT, which is the tick intervention is very, very specific. And other therapies were tried, and a child says, I'm not doing this because it's not going to work. And that was his experience, and nothing I could say could change his mind. So keep that in mind, that there is psychological harm, and you may be actually creating a child who's growing increasingly resistant to therapies that you want to try later. So reading is a remarkable, remarkable feat, and readers are made, not born. What do I mean by that? So those of you who are teachers, you will understand what this is all about. In order to learn to read, you need to coordinate many processes. Let's take the word cat. In the earliest stages of reading, a child hears that as a single burst of sound, cat. But with experience and exposure to how sounds and words are made, the brain begins to segment that singular burst of sound, cat, into k, a, t. And that's phonemic awareness. Words are made of smaller sounds that can be separated. Now, children who struggle with phonemic awareness will struggle to learn to read. This is a very important foundational skill that in some cases requires remediation in order for you to get to that next stage of reading. Now, if you want to learn to read, you have to take the sounds that you hear separately and then tack them onto these obscure looking squiggles on a page, which are letters. So the goes with the C letter, the A goes with the squiggly A letter, and so on. Now, when you learn to read, then you start to see these separate sort of letters and you tack on sounds and you build up words. Now, our brain also has to tack on meaning. So you need to know that cat, which is spelled C-A-T, is actually a furry animal with a tail. That's higher order understanding. Now, when we look at the reading network in the brains of efficient readers, you see a whole bunch of centers that are connected in the left hemisphere, so the left half of the brain. So this is the ventral system at the bottom, the green, and the dorsal system at the top, which is the red. So the ventral system is really important for the visual processing of letters, and the dorsal system at the top and front breaks down letters and sounds and builds them up again and tacks on meaning. I want to again draw your attention. I don't know if you can see my pointer here, but this middle area that looks like a curved arm, this is the temporal lobe that sits around your ear, and the crease, the top crease, is called the superior temporal gyrus. And boy, is it going to be important in the slides that you see, because it plays a central role in decoding. Okay, so here's the interesting thing. No brain is born with these areas connected. So evolution has equipped our brains to speak with language, but reading is a human invention that's only about 5,000 years old. So from an evolutionary standpoint, that is a relatively new thing. So the only way our brains learn to read is by changing through experience. And reading instruction that teaches the alphabetic principle, which means teaching explicitly how sounds correspond to letters, helps to reorganize the brain through neuroplasticity, forming connections that allow us to read accurately and make meaning out of printed text. So what we know about individuals with dyslexia or at risk for dyslexia is they have differences in brain circuitry and structures compared to typical readers. So let's look at a very interesting brain scan. So brain differences are evident from very early on. So you'll see the top two brains are kids at risk for reading difficulties, and the bottom are a compilation of brains from these kindergarten kids not at risk for reading difficulties. So on the left side is the left view of the brain, and the right side is the right view. Now, kids in this study, these were pre-reading tasks. So kids in the study were asked to segment sort of sounds in words, hear the sounds in words, but they were also asked what sounds go with specific letters. So they weren't even asked to read at all. And what they found is that the kids who struggled had the opposite brain activation pattern than kids who didn't struggle. So if you look at the kids, the two top brains, the left side shows very little orange activation in that sort of temporal lobe area, that bent arm area. But what you'll see is the right side is trying to do the work. That is not what efficient brains do if you read well. If you look at the kids who are not at risk, you see this beautiful big blob of orange activation in the left temporal lobe, right along that edge where you can see the crease known as the superior temporal gyrus. So brains are responding to letters and sounds differently, and it leads to inaccuracies. It's the way the brains are wired, but bear with me, fortunately is coming up, and the fortunately is neuroplasticity. Brains have the capability of responding to experience, to intervention, and fundamentally changing in ways that move you from an at-risk brain to a reading brain. So I just want to throw this in there because this is a question I often get. So what if ADHD is in the mix? Can you treat ADHD and can that help the brain isolate sounds and tack sounds onto letters more accurately? So this was a large review study that asked those questions. And because I really want to focus on dyslexia in this talk, I am just going to jump straight to the conclusion. So medications can support aspects of the reading network. And we certainly see this at the Possibilities Clinic in many students who are struggling to read and who are with us in our Academic Services Division. And I can't see all the participants here, but I want to do a big shout out to Tara Doherty, who's our Director of Academic Services, Emily Veal, who is a very talented direct instruction interventionist in our program who is changing brains through neuroplasticity. Huge shout out. I monitor change in those students. If there are other tutors, I can't see you, so thank you for being here. But what we see in our Academic Services Division in students who are getting evidence-based reading intervention is that when ADHD is treated effectively, it can sort of facilitate that learning and that decoding work that the brain is trying so hard to do. We also see this in the provincial demonstration schools, and shout out if there are members of the team here. Again, I can't see you, but thank you for the dedicated work you do. But well-controlled attention can facilitate effective kind of neuroplastic changes, and focus is a very important ingredient in reading. So what we know is that ADHD treatment is important, supporting the reading network, but we need to actually do specific targeted interventions to change a brain for reading when it comes to decoding those sounding out skills. So when we think of academic intervention and how to help dyslexic students, we need to think about levels of intervention from Tier 1 to Tier 3. Now, Tier 1 is whole class curriculum or whole class teaching. If that instruction includes and is solid in sounding out skills, speed of reading, and comprehension, 75 to 90% of your class will become readers. No question. Tier 2 are kids who need a bit more supplemental instruction. So this could be one-on-one, this could be in small groups, and approximately 10 to 25% of kids will benefit and be in this group, will benefit from Tier 2 supplemental instruction. Now, kids who have dyslexia, who are struggling very much to decode, who are not getting in a classroom, who are struggling in Tier 2, need Tier 3 intensive intervention. And these would be programs like direct instruction, capital D, capital I, which we use at the clinic, Empower, which is developed at the Hospital for Sick Children, which is used in the provincial demonstration schools. These are intensive intervention which are very principled in how you work through the program. Unfortunately, Tier 3 is often not offered in school boards. And I think this is the reason why people think dyslexia is not treatable, because the highest level of instruction in schools that are not science of reading schools is Tier 2. And Tier 2 instruction is not going to change a dyslexic brain. So you walk away with this idea that there's nothing you can do, but that is not the case. So there are different ways and different programs that are considered Tier 3, but they all have these things in common. Decoding, comprehension, fluency are taught explicitly. They are principled, small, doable steps. There is an extended time spent on consolidating skills, so you do not move forward onto lesson 2 unless you're errorless or close to errorless on lesson 1. There is speeded practice, so fluency, so trying to retrieve those words quickly and accurately. As I mentioned, comprehensive reading programs cover decoding, that's sounding out, fluency, which is accuracy and speed, and comprehension. They also have cumulative review, so you can go back and also move forward based on what you recall and remember. There are self-regulation strategies built in. This stuff is really hard, and it can get tough for kids to stick it out and do it. And so those self-regulation strategies are built in, and there is also progress monitoring. So a portion of our students in our academic services at the clinic receive progress monitoring with our academic team and with me, and we look very carefully at whether the students are progressing, and if not, what do we have to pump up in order to make those students move forward. And I can tell you the Provincial Demonstration School, they are really doing heavy-duty progress monitoring as well, which is a marker of a really great and comprehensive program. So as I mentioned, in order to make efficient readers, there needs to be this explicit instruction of how sounds map onto letters and how you say those words quickly. At the Possibilities Clinic in our academic services program, we use DI reading programs. That's capital D, capital I. You might see small d, small I on some report card comments from teachers, but that is not capital D, capital I. Want to move forward quickly because I know we sort of lost some time at the beginning. I will say that we feel very confident in our use of direct instruction programs. This is an elegant research study looking at 328 studies over 50 years and found direct instruction to be extremely effective. Now, what happens when you do intensive reading intervention in brains of children? Well, neuroplasticity happens. So here is a study. I won't go into the details in the interest of time, but what you can see at the top is on the left side is the left half of the brain. On the right side is the right half of the brain. Before intervention, you see the kids are trying to sound out words inaccurately using that right-sided temporal lobe. But after intervention, the right side becomes more quiet and the left side pumps up. Now, you're going to see this pattern in dyslexic studies over and over and over again. The right side is trying to do the work, but the right side is not built for decoding. So it is a guesser. So it gets on the bullhorn and says, it's winter, even though it's writer. And you may say to a child, come on, slow down, try to sound it out. But as long as that right-sided circuit is doing the heavy lifting, the problem is it's going to guess and it's not going to be accurate. So when you do intervention, like this is the letter, this is the sound, this is how they blend, and you continue those kinds of explicit instructions over and over again in a very principled way, you turn on this left-sided circuit for decoding, and when you turn on, it's turned on for life. Here is another study looking at intervention, 70 hours of phonemic instruction in 8 to 10-year-olds. This is not, ADD here is not attention deficit disorder. It's these are two different types of phonemic programs. What you see here in this flat line is kids spent 16 months in a special education class with no evidence-based intervention for reading. And as you can see, their scores in reading did not improve. They flatlined, but once you introduce 70 hours of instruction, they saw improvements in decoding, speed, and comprehension. What does not change, however, if you wait to improve reading, is you may get rate or speed that kind of flatlines compared to peers. So your accuracy in decoding will increase and a student will get faster than they were before. But compared to peers who have been reading since grade 1 and reading very well, your speed may not look the same as your peers if you started intervention later. I'm going to move quickly through these last slides. This is a study by Maureen Lovett who looked at the percentage of students whose reading scores normalized with intervention compared to students in the orange who did not receive intervention. I'm going to move quickly through these next 3 slides. what you'll see here, and I just want you to see what happens to the blue bars. When you intervene in grade 1 with evidence-based intervention, and she did it for a total of 100 to 125 hours, approximately 70% of kids moved from a very low reading profile to a strong reading profile. However, if you waited to introduce intervention in grade 2, the amount of kids who rise in their scores to an average range drops to 50% when you give 100 hours of instruction, and it drops even further when you wait until grade 3. So the bottom line is, if you wait to intervene, you're going to have to throw more and more and more intervention to get gains. Okay. So see how much more time I have. Okay. So what I want to do is just talk really quickly about intervention or accommodations. This is a great book by David Flink, who has very severe dyslexia and ADHD, and he talks about how he used accommodations to succeed in high school and university, like assistive technology. Some parents will come to me and say, well, why don't we just focus on intervention? Or let's forget about intervention and just do accommodations. I really don't like this either or dichotomy. So bear with me. I'm going to go a little bit. It's going to seem off the rails here, but I want you to just, in the last 2 minutes, I want you to follow this analogy with me. And I'm a big fan of TV series, so I want to talk to you about The Summer I Turned Pretty. Bear with me. There's a reason I'm doing this. Okay. In The Summer I Turned Pretty, which was a hit, like Netflix hit, based on the novels of Jesse Hahn. I don't know how many of you have seen this, but basically there was a girl named Belly Conklin, and she is torn between different boys. Conrad Fisher is intense, he's often inaccessible, and he boosts her heart rate. Jeremiah Fisher is his brother. He is helpful, he is more accessible, and he is always accommodating. And Benito represents lowered expectation. He works for now. He's her Paris boyfriend when she has to escape the beach house in the US and try to figure things out. Benito works for now, and he's not tied to a long-term plan. Now, let's think about The Summer I Turned Pretty Great at Reading. Let's think about Conrad as evidence-based interventions. Intense, sadly, often inaccessible in schools, but boost skills. Let's think of Jeremiah as accommodations. They're helpful, more accessible, and they work around challenges like assistive technology, like books you can hear versus read. And then there is Benito, who represents modifications, lowered expectations, works for now, but not tied to a long-term plan. So I have a child in grade 5. I'm going to modify because they can read at grade 1, so I'm going to give them grade level work. My first true love will always be, as a neuropsychologist, evidence-based interventions to change brain circuits with the elegant neuroplasticity that brains have. Okay? However, I want to maintain friendships with accommodations. These things have to work together. So if I'm trying to change a brain circuit for reading, and let's say a child is in grade 8, but they're reading at a grade 5 level, they're still being expected to do grade 8 work, and their speed and their accuracy is not going to be enough for them to read all the textbook chapters that their more fluent peers are reading. So you have to get that information in the brain somehow. So as we're trying to change brain circuits for reading, we're still using accommodations to allow a child to succeed at grade level work. I am not a big fan of modifications, lower level work for kids with LD who by definition have average IQ, because I feel strongly that they should be using accommodations to do grade level work, and they should be getting evidence-based intervention, particularly in reading, where we know that changing brain circuits is possible. So address dyslexia with multiple approaches, treat dyslexia and comorbidities, including ADHD, with science-backed strategies that boost skills, Continue accommodations like assistive technology to work around challenges and support speed and accuracy, and monitor progress to ensure multiple approaches are working well together to support academic success and mental health. So thank you for sticking with me. I know I went kind of fast trying to move through those slides. Here is our contact information. I'm going to take another sip of water, and I am free to answer questions you may have.
Thank you, everyone. Okay, so we will start answering some questions. Dr. Miles, so the first one. The cost of evidence-based direct therapies, for example, OG Empower, are prohibitive for most families, especially as they are often 2 times a week. Is there anything else that they can do instead?
Yeah, so evidence-based interventions are very intense, and they have to happen at specific, sorry, stop sharing there. Evidence-based interventions are they're intense, and they have to be done with a certain frequency in order to change brain circuits for reading. So I think it's very important to work with your school, if you can, and see if the school is interested in becoming a science of reading school by introducing either Empower. If Empower is not possible, then direct instruction with some of the reading resource staff. I know that when I was in a school board, I was really proud of getting direct instruction in those schools that I worked with, and we had a principal who was on board and a teachers, spec ed teachers who are on board. So you can always see if that is possible if you are in a tier 3 sort of need and situation. And you may need the help of your psychologist to work with the principal and talk about the science of reading and see if direct instruction programs can be placed in schools. I certainly know that some schools are using it in their resource time. They pull kids out, and they work on it at least twice a week for like 40 minutes or so.
And we've seen, just sorry to interrupt, I think we've seen some schools, like private schools, also have it. So if you're looking for a private school, some will say they do intervention, but I think it's worthwhile to ask them, okay, what do you actually do? And ask them if they actually do, DI or whatever OG or something specific rather than general. So I think if you use like ourkids.net or something like that, looking for private, they don't really tell you what to do. We're looking to build a resource like that will tell you on our clinic website, to tell you what they actually offer. Risha, why don't we go to, because we try to answer some as we went along, but I see questions live once they're coming in now. So why don't you go into the 822 one and ask those?
So the one at 820, so since intervention ideally start in grade 1, how does a parent of a grade 1 student who is slow with reading, they can't afford a full psych ed, know for sure that the child needs intensive, costly DI intervention?
Okay, so that is a fantastic question. You don't technically need to wait for a psych ed assessment to identify reading problems or a need for direct instruction intervention, for example. So direct instruction does include placement tests where you basically can see where a child would start in what lesson and in what program to support reading remediation. And again, if DI can be introduced in some public schools, then you don't need to wait for a psych ed or a formal LD to get started. There is a book called, I hesitate to say it because for kids who are really tier 3, you need intensive principled intervention that is extended. There is a book, though, called Teach Your Child to Read in 100 Easy Lessons, which is also mentioned, I believe, in Sold a Story. It is based on direct instruction. In fact, it's the same author. But for kids who are really struggling outside of grade 1, 2, 3, I would really recommend like the full program, not the 100 easy lessons. But from a kind of emerging reader point of view, 100 Easy Lessons is a great book to look at to teach your child those early letters and sounds, but it's not going to be enough if the struggle is more intense than that. But that's a great start. The other thing I wanted to mention, a wonderful website, Balanced Literacy Diet. If you put that in Google, you will come up. It's out of Oise. I'm not exactly sure of what the website address is. We could share it later because it has a different website name now. But if you look up Balanced Literacy Diet, which is through Google, you will come up with this wonderful website out of Oise developed by a psychologist whose name I'm forgetting. My apologies to her, Dale Willows, and she has strategies that teachers in grades 1, I think, to 6 can do to support reading. You could do these strategies too. Fun strategies like with cars going across certain letters and sounds. And she has videos, like 1 to 2 minute videos showing how teachers in actual classrooms are using those activities. So that's another way to sort of get your child engaged in letter-sound relationships from very early on.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Miles. The second question we have is, do we offer intervention services in French?
We do not. I'm sorry to say we don't. This one's a little tricky because I am not aware of any French decoding interventions that are as principled as DI English. So that's the struggle there. There are some, but not principled like DI that I know of.
All right. The next question we have is using Empower twice a week an effective intervention, or does it have to be used more frequently?
Okay, so intensive interventions sort of spell out the recommended frequency. So at what we do, ideally it would be 5 times a week, but that can be prohibitive. So we do at least twice a week. So our academic services at Possibilities, you have to do a DI at least twice a week. You can't budge a brain circuit with a once a week DI lesson. But with twice a week, we are seeing discernible gains in decoding and reading skills. So I feel very comfortable saying that. Ideally, it's more. I know that Empower, I believe, dictates a 4 or 5 day a week frequency. It might be 5. I don't myself offer Empower, but the folks at the provincial demonstration schools do, and that is, I believe, it's a 5 times a week sort of investment in time.
Thank you,
That's
Dr. Miles.
dictated by the program itself. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt
No,
there.
thank you. No worries. So we'll just take one last question. It is 8:30. So my child has been doing OG therapy for 3 years, grade 3 and 5, and is now reading at grade level. Her spelling, however, is fairly poor and gives her a lot of anxiety and makes her telling to write. Should she continue more OG tutoring to address the spelling, or is this pretty much what we should expect with dyslexia, and should we work on creating fluency with spell check and other spelling supports?
Okay, that's a really hard question. The last question of the night. Okay, so just a disclaimer here, we don't offer OG at the clinic. We work with direct instruction. So I'm not sure how OG works on the spelling side and what the intensity is as you continue down the OG line. I will say that we do offer Spelling Mastery, which is a DI program with our reading more in the service of supporting the decoding learning. there is sort of this strange dissociation in the research where you can improve decoding, but spelling may remain more depressed or compromised. So as I said, we use sort of spelling activities to support the decoding learning, but decoding improvements, unfortunately, are not necessarily guarantees of spelling accuracy. So if you're trying to support your child in sort of elegant reading compositions and focusing on how we create sort of structures for written exercises, I would focus on using spell check so that more of her working memory and her creativity or his creativity is focused on that, because you can get really tripped up and it can really suck a lot of your working memory to try to figure out how to spell if your brain's not sure of how to spell, and things are going to get log jammed and your child may not want to write so much. So I would focus on assistive technology, accommodations, working on spell check.
All
If the
right.
reading's at grade level, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Miles. And we just like to thank you, everyone, for joining tonight's session. And we would also like to thank Dr. Miles for sharing this very informative presentation with us. I do see there's a few more questions, so please feel free to contact us at info@possibilitiesclinic.com. And also be sure to keep an eye out for any presentations.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
really
you.
appreciate your presence here tonight. Thanks.